The following half-hour show is a paid political program and is not endorsed by this station, management, or staff.
The following program is sponsored by Excalibur Insurance Management Services.
Welcome back to our fall season on the Volpe Report. First of all, I hope you all had a safe and happy and productive summer. Like many of you, since I was a young boy, I have always associated Labor Day with the end of summer. And my internal clock always sets the alarm each Labor Day that it's time to go back to school or work. Work right now for me. As we are putting the finishing touches on 9 years of this show, I genuinely look forward to bringing you the guests that will allow me to discuss the issues which we face as citizens of northeastern and central Pennsylvania, as well as being American citizens. I would be remiss without mentioning that today's season opening show falls on 9/11. A date which will always live in infamy. To plagiarize the words of former President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in reference to the dastardly attack on Pearl Harbor, it's a date that will always crease our minds and imaginations and lives for the rest of our lives, as well as for future generations. Many Americans lost their lives on that day, and many military warriors would go on to lose their lives in the wars that followed. I know you will all keep them in your thoughts and prayers as we remember that day. Before turning our attention to some national issues that we face in this historic election season, we start by turning our attention to Pennsylvania and some breaking issues here. Our guest today is Pennsylvania Representative Greg Rothman of the 87th Legislative District of Cumberland County, who sits in the leadership caucus for the Republican Party in the House and had served as the chairman of the House Republican Campaign Committee. He has relinquished those roles as he is currently the Republican nominee for Pennsylvania Senator from that part of the state. He also currently still sits as a member of the Appropriations, Insurance, Liquor Control, and Transportation Committees. He is also the Deputy Chairman for the House Policy Committee. Greg was first elected to the House in a special election in 2015. He was re-elected in 2016, 2018, and 2020. Prior to his public service in the Pennsylvania General Assembly and his real estate career, Rothman enlisted in the Marine Corps during Operation Desert Storm. He served nearly 10 years in the Marine Corps Reserve, rising to the rank of Staff Sergeant before being honorably discharged in 2001. His service led the President of the United States to appoint him to the National Veterans Business Development Corporation Board to encourage veterans to start entrepreneurial ventures. Rothman resides in Cumberland County, and he is the proud father of 5 children. And we look to getting our season started discussing issues that are breaking news here in Pennsylvania.
This is the Volpe Report, a weekly news and political interview show examining the latest local, state, and national issues with Chuck Volpe. Insightful, informative, controversial, the area's premier political talk show, the Volpe Report.
Greg, welcome as our kickoff guest to the fall-winter season of the Volpe Report.
Thank you for having me, Chuck. It's an honor, as always.
It is truly my pleasure, Greg. And before we get into policy issues, as this is the first show and we've just passed Labor Day, which to me is the official start of real life starts back up. I could tell you, even though I've turned 60, I still get the same feeling after Labor Day as I did when I was 12 going back to school. Like, okay, it's now time to get serious. I hope you have found some time, even as a candidate, which we'll talk about in a second, to have some time this summer with your family and enjoy it.
Yes, of course. And that's, I've got a pretty good balance being so close to the Capitol. My commute home is 8 minutes, so I get to go home for dinner every night. But I spent a lot of the summer campaigning, and that's been great because I'm now running for the new Senate seat in central Pennsylvania. So knocking on doors, which to me is exercise, and nice days, sunny days are fun to knock on doors. So
you're always in the thick of the fight. We're a leader in the House caucus. You were the chairman, now passed, but had been chairman of the HRCC, the House Republican Campaign Committee, a post you relinquished, obviously, now, since you are the Republican nominee for Pennsylvania Senator in your district. So let me ask you, obviously, how's the campaign going? You obviously won a contested primary. You won it by a fairly large margin. and now you face a Democratic opponent. How are your prospects, and how's the campaign going?
Yeah, I started knocking on doors again after the primary. I did take June off. We had a budget we were working on in June, early July, and I took a little bit of July off to spend time with the kids and get back to my real estate work too. But I started knocking doors the end of July, and I've already knocked on over 4,400 doors in about 35 days. So I'm doing about 100, 120 doors. The people are great. They're receptive. I mean, you know how hot it's been. Sure. So it's good exercise. And anytime anybody offers me a bottle of water, I take it and I mark them down as that's a likely vote I'm going to get.
Yeah.
But the people are frustrated, Chuck, and we'll probably talk about this more. But I mean, inflation is real. Ronald Reagan had a great quote about how dangerous inflation was. I mean, there's nothing that cuts into your household budget like inflation, especially when you're talking about, you know, massive increases in gas and food and in supply issues. The people I'm talking to are upset about it, and they're not, you know, my district is, with the exception of not having an urban area, is a microcosm of Pennsylvania. I've got a lot of suburban areas, a lot of rural areas, some agriculture, and a lot of industry too, and, you know, more blue collar industry. And the people are upset. I mean, they know that this is not right, and they know there are ways out of inflation, and they know there are policies to get you into it. And what the Biden administration has done and the Wolf administration has done is just got us into this inflationary recession.
An amazing thing has occurred, which kind of fits in today's culture. The Biden administration has adopted a policy. They don't discuss the word recession and continue to maintain there is not one. They won't even make reference to the R word at all. And they'll point to illusory, false things like, well, wages are up and the deficit is down. And, well, that's a direct result of the trillions they put into the economy. Of course, wages are up. But what they won't tell you, it is lagging behind the consumer price index because prices are going up at double the rate of what wages are, which is inflationary and recessionary. They won't point out that we're going on 3 consecutive quarters where the gross national product has decreased, a sign of inflation. They won't talk about the fact that the Federal Reserve just raised interest rates 75 basis points, the highest in 30 years, also significant of inflation and recession. So even they apparently, I've used the quip about like the ostrich with incoming danger buries its head in the sand, and if they can't see the danger, they figure it's not there. Well, that's the tack. Instead of dealing with it, they're pretending it's not a recession.
Well, and it's insincere, and it's trying to mislead the voters. That's what this is about. I mean, my little kids know what a recession is. My kids knew what a recession was back in the last time we had one. You know, if you have 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth, that's a recession. Right. It's 1 + 1 = 2. You can't just change then again, the left will change definitions to suit their purpose. They talk to us about the science. I mean, there's also math, and we know what a recession is. And though it does remind me of the great Ronald Reagan joke, is a recession is when you lose your job. I'm sorry, recession is when your neighbor loses his job. Depression is when you lose your job, and recovery is when Jimmy Carter loses it.
Touche. I do remember that quote. And ironically, the reference is apt in that when Reagan took over as president after 4 failed years of Democratic policies by then President Jimmy Carter, stagflation, we had an energy crisis, sound familiar back then, waiting in line for gas. I remember, because I just started driving then to high school, Greg, that you could only go and fill your car up on odd numbered days depending on what you were assigned. I mean, so...
Yeah, exactly. And it was a malaise. Remember, that was the term malaise. And all the money that we've put into the economy is creating this recession. And yet there is a way out. And the way out is deregulation and cutting tax rates. And that creates more production. And there's more supply, which then equals the demand. And it improves the economy and does not create inflation.
What are you doing in the General Assembly in Pennsylvania to help the citizens of Pennsylvania deal with inflation and recession that we are in?
Yeah, so the way to get out of a recession is to create more production and more economic activity. And so, you know, one of the first pieces of legislation I introduced when I got to the House 7 years ago was to cut the corporate net income tax which at 9.99% was the second highest or the highest in the country. It discouraged job creators from coming into our great Commonwealth. And so we actually passed it in the budget. We got it down to 7.99. It could go down as low as 5.99 in the next couple of years. I'd like to see it even go down further, but that's a good first step. And, you know, I have in every session passed a regulatory reform package that the nice thing is we pass in the House. It hasn't got to the Senate yet, but every time we pass it, the administration does something to sort of, you know, adopt some of the legislation principles. But during COVID, the administration suspended literally thousands of regulations. And so Leader Benninghoff put me on a special House panel that got together a task force and reviewed all those regulations and have sent letters to the governor saying, suspend those regulations. If we could survive the COVID without these regulations, let's not reinstitute them. So regulatory reform, cutting tax rates, getting people back to work, actually working, not just giving them money. You know, it's biblical, right? You teach a man to fish, you feed him forever. Right? If you give him fish, you feed him for a meal. I mean, a job is the greatest social economic development program there is. And I've been working since I was 11, and you probably have too. There's nothing more important than we do than give people jobs. And so that's what I've been focusing on in the House, and I hope to focus on the same things when I'm in the Senate.
Yeah, one of the great, to me, misconceptions is that, you know, obviously the Fed raising interest rates 75 basis points, and it's going to, I hear they're going to raise them again, is one of the antidotes to inflation, to get money out of the economy effectively, make borrowing it more expensive. But that's only half the tale. The other half the tale is what the Biden administration and the Wolf administration is not doing. You need to cut discretionary spending. Like you've talked about earlier in this program, you've talked about how families are struggling with their budgets and coming to terms at the kitchen table effectively with the cost of food, the cost of gas, all of the things that through no fault of their own, they had a budget they were comfortably living on, and now all of a sudden they don't. They don't have enough money in savings or in their income. So one of the first things that has to be done is you cut discretionary spending. So what the Biden administration has come up with, they've just put 700 or so billion more money into the economy. Of course, they're calling it the Inflation Reduction Act, which is not only counterintuitive, it's actually an oxymoron. They're going to spur more inflation, number one. Number two, the president, Biden, just submitted his budget for 2023 that includes an 11% increase in discretionary spending, which is ridiculous facing the recession and inflation woes that we currently have. I use the analogy we discussed off camera a while ago. You know what? When you get overcome with credit card debt, there's a way out. You consolidate that debt. You have one monthly payment that you can afford to pay down that debt, and eventually that debt will go away. Well, of course, the other thing you need to do is cut up all your credit cards. Because if you keep adding more debt, you're just going to dig the hole deeper, and that's precisely what congressional Democrats, what President Biden, and what Governor Tom Wolf are doing in Pennsylvania, wanting to give people more and more and more free money. I loved your little analogy there about the fishing thing. Teach a man to fish or a woman to fish, they'll eat for the rest of their life. Just give them fish, they'll eat for a meal. And that continues to be the approach, and it's wrong.
Yeah, and it's why we have a labor crisis right now, which in my area, we don't have enough people working. And the reason they're not working is because they're getting paid not to work. And you're going to give them another $2,000, and they're going to say, well, we'll extend our vacation a little longer. And
of course,
you know, we need workers, or our economy slows down. You're already seeing that. And so, yeah, stop spending money. Government needs to stop spending money. Encourage investment. Encourage economic activity, and try to attract job creators to Pennsylvania.
We're going to take our break now, and we're going to come back to a couple of issues that are specific to Pennsylvania that obviously you have a role in. So we'll take this break now for my 3-minute view on the recession the Democrats are denying, but we're in one. After a summer that flew by, a lot happened that merits comment. I'll begin with the oppressive recession we are mired in, which President Biden and the congressional Democrats continue to lie about and deny. Just like the proverbial ostrich, when faced with impending doom, sticks its head in the sand, in the belief that if it can't see the danger, It's not there. Biden and the progressive crew won't utter the R word and instead disassemble about job growth and increasing wages, which is demonstrably false in light of the trillions put into the economy over COVID. When you start stringing multiple financial quarters together with decreasing gross national product, when the consumer price index raises 8.6% in the second quarter, when the change in price received by domestic producers rose 10.6% over what it was last year, which suggests inflation continues accelerating, and the Federal Reserve Board raises its benchmark interest rates 75 basis points, the highest in 30 years, the inevitable outcome is recession. This is the same scenario that occurred in the early 1980s, which produced the horrific recession of the 80s. But Biden and crew will not address the biggest cause, government spending. Remember, over a year ago, I did an editorial on this station pointing out that former Democratic Treasury Secretary to Democratic President Bill Clinton, as well as the chief economic advisor to Democratic President Barack Obama, one Larry Summers, warned Biden and the Democrats in early 2021 that if they continued to dump trillions into the economy, the result would be record inflation. Summers also predicted the Fed would significantly raise interest rates, producing a recession, the one we're in now. The idea that inflation can be dealt with only on the monetary side by raising interest rates is like the ancient alchemists trying to turn iron sulfide into gold. As Jay Cost, a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, wrote for the National Review, and I quote, "Inflation is the problem of too much money demanding too few goods and services. Decreasing federal spending would be one solution to the problem. But Biden won't have any of that. His fiscal year 2023 budget increased domestic discretionary spending 11%. Democrats in the Congress will have nothing to do with any such notion because to do so would prompt a backlash from progressives. Better to rail against the oil companies and suggest Summers is a liar. Just like the ostrich, Biden can ignore the approaching grizzly bear and stick his head in the sand. But if he does, after November 8th, his head will be the only thing left, like the ostrich." Welcome back, Greg. As I said, we have a few issues that we need to discuss that are kind of, Pennsylvania related. The Republican National Committee has just recently, in fact, I believe on Friday, filed a constitutional lawsuit against Pennsylvania and the Wolf administration, alleging that in our elections, the policies they have put into place, which allows for what I'll use their word in the lawsuit, curing ballots. The curing of a ballot is to take one that's illegal based on the requirements of the law in Pennsylvania, and they will fix it or cure it by either adding a name or a date or some other requirement that the ballot lacks so the ballot can be counted. They're basically suing, saying that is unequal protection under the law, unconstitutional. You're actually disenfranchising all of the voters that did it properly, and all that. So the Pennsylvania Republicans have also joined in that lawsuit, along with other groups, along with citizens in Pennsylvania that feel they've been disenfranchised. I'd like to get your thoughts on what's going on in Pennsylvania. Election reform is an issue you've taken up. It's been a hot button item. There's been no real agreement with Wolf administration, and he's been vetoing your attempts. So where does all that stand, and what are your thoughts on the lawsuit about defective ballots being cured?
Yeah, and look, it's not even just that disenfranchising one voter. Different counties are treating the curing of these mail-in ballots differently. So you have a Republican county that says, nope, there's no date on it, we can't count it. Well, you have someone in a Democratic county. I mean, this actually happened in the Senate race. The county says, yes, we will count that. I mean, if you're going to count the ballots and allow curing, then you do it throughout all 67 counties. But that's not what was happening. Look, we passed a comprehensive, probably too comprehensive a voting reform back with Act 77 that allowed no excuse absentee ballots, which meant you didn't have to be out of town on work or you didn't have to be infirmed. We wanted to make it easier for people to vote. We never anticipated nor allowed drop boxes. We absolutely, I can tell you, because I worked very hard on it, spoke about it on the floor, ballot harvesting, where you collect other people's ballots. Even one person's ballot is illegal. That ballot should not be counted, which, if you remember, the governor said his wife, I think, voted for him, or he voted for his wife, which means those ballots aren't counted. And look, I want everybody to be able to vote. I want to make it easier for people to vote. But there's reasons we have rules like this. And the simplest is, why shouldn't you have to show a an ID? Why don't we have voter ID? My 7-year-old daughter goes to the library and she's got to show her ID to check out a book. If I go into the state Capitol building as a representative, and when I'm a senator, I have to show an ID to get into the Capitol building. But for some reason, it's burdensome to ask someone to show an ID before they vote. And we need to do the same thing with mail-in voting, because it is the hallmark of democracy to have fair and free elections. So we should make it easy to vote and hard to cheat.
Well, right now, not to be the bearer of bad news, but even though you're poised to even make more significant gains in the House and the Senate in Pennsylvania, it looks like a tough road to hoe for the Republican nominee, Senator Doug Mastriano. He's still trailing pretty significantly in the polls, and so you're got to be at least looking at realistically the possibility of at least 4 more years with Josh Shapiro, the Democratic nominee.
Yeah. I'm a little more optimistic now. Keep in mind, my district is a heavily Republican area, but I was looking at polls from 2018 when Wagner was running, and so here's my theory: if you're running as far ahead as Shapiro thinks and tells people he's running, why are you even talking about your opponent? Right. I have not heard one thing about Josh Shapiro, what he's going to do for Pennsylvania, other than him just attacking Doug Mastriano. So. He did say he wouldn't have gone as far on the COVID, the governor's draconian COVID measures, but he actually sued to protect those draconian measures in court. So he says he'll do more to, get the economy going. I've heard nothing from him other than negativity. And so I actually think Mastriano has a shot. 2020 polls around this time had Biden winning by 7 points. He won by 1. Right. Right. And so, polls can be poisoned, and polls can be used by sampling. But I think it's probably a 4-point race right now, and that's margin of error. And,
of course.
I think, the revelation recently this week that John Fetterman is sending his children to a $34,000 a year for each kid to go to private school, while he's opposing common sense school choice and vouchers for the kids who can't afford, parents who can't afford to send their kids to school. He talks about public school being the most important thing we do, and yet he won't even send his own kids to public school. Now, look, I don't blame him for that. He's got, the Democrats have destroyed the public schools in Braddock too. But John Fetterman has never had a job. I mean, what he talks about being a blue collar working guy. What job has he ever? You and I have had real blue collar jobs.
I've been in the ditch laying blacktop.
Absolutely.
My soles were melting on my work shoes.
Yep. Do you think John Fetterman's ever had a job like that?
Well, it's one of the great Houdini acts in my lifetime from a politician. He has sold himself as this man of the people, mayor of a steel town outside of Pittsburgh, Braddock, a good working class bunch of folks in that town, like we have up here in northeastern and central Pennsylvania that covers this media market. Same kind of people. And but he sold himself as a man of the people when he is a Harvard-educated, trust fund, silver spoon baby. So I find that a lot of the far left are that elitists and believe that they have a right to tell other people how they should live their lives because they're more qualified. But he puts on biker gear, rolls up his pant cuffs, and has the high boots and the tattoos and the whole bit, and gets on a Harley, and he sold it well. I mean, Connor Lamb could never break through. Right now, obviously, Dr. Oz is trailing pretty significantly, it seems, also, if you believe the polls. So, but, no one has yet been able to call him out on who he really is, and so far, he's hiding out. He's just riding the wave.
Well, I think now that it's Labor Day, we've gotten through Labor Day, that's traditional start when at least Republicans start campaigning. So I'm optimistic. I mean, I think with what's going on in the economy and gas prices and inflation, Republicans are going to have their best year since, I think, 1866, when we won the Civil War, and then we won 39 out of 50 Senate seats. So
wow,
it's going to be a good year for Republicans.
You know, I've said this in my lifetime, and some of the most important issues we face as a country, you know, the Democrats are on a far left position that is unlike even their tenure. That, like, I was a Democrat for 45 years and believed in the principles of the Democratic Party, and I'm a Republican now because there used to be a place for conservative or moderate Democrats, and they've clearly been pushed off to the side in the Democratic Party. I feel bad for my Democratic friends.
Yeah, and look, crime is a huge issue that the Democrats are just flat out wrong on. I mean, we had Democrats in the House, Chuck, debating against a strangulation law, saying that we shouldn't be against the law to strangle someone. I mean, they have blocked every effort for us to bring the DA of Philadelphia County. All we want them to do is prosecute and put murderers in prison. I mean, that's where they belong. And this, you know, no bail or no incarceration or not charging someone for committing murder. That's not going to work. I mean, there's an effect, and the effect is that Philadelphia is now the murder capital of the country.
They had more murders than New York City, even though New York City is 7 or 8 times larger in population than Philadelphia.
Wow. Yeah. Look, the city of Philadelphia is, and all our municipalities are a creation of the legislature. We through our Constitution, created them. They certainly depend upon us for lots of money. And we have every right to, and I'll use the word ironically, but to police a public official, whether elected or not, who's not doing his job. And, you know, the same Democrats didn't have a problem with impeachment in the last presidential administration. They did it twice. And we actually have a DA who's not prosecuting murders. And we voted to give the authority to the Attorney General, at his request, by the way, to prosecute gun crimes and in the city of Philadelphia, in the county of Philadelphia. And now Shapiro's gotten awful quiet because, remember, he is, on his words, the top cop. I mean, he is the man who's supposed to be in charge of law enforcement for the whole state. So this is on his watch, too. And I think that's going to have an effect in the fall, too. But meanwhile, we want to get something done to get someone in there who's going to prosecute murderers.
Sure. Well, regrettably, as always, our half hour flies by, Greg. Again, I want to thank you coming right out of this holiday weekend for making time, especially as a candidate yourself. I wish you the best in your senatorial election and look forward to working with you in the future. I hope I'll be able to call you Senator the next time you're on this show, and I look forward to that day.
Thank you. And I just, you know, it's 21 years ago that the Twin Towers fell, and those heroic people out in Shanksville brought down that plane, and really the first act of defense or self-defense in the war on terror. But I can't, I'm sure you too. I mean, I get chills thinking about that day. And I was had just gotten out of the Marine Corps, actually went back in for a month. But that's will live as the worst day in my lifetime, and hopefully
it's one of the worst.
We've learned from that, too.
It's one of the worst events in American history. It ranks with things like the Civil War, the Kennedy assassination. I mean, you're talking about life-altering, nation-altering events, and clearly, and thank you, how appropriate that you would mention that as we are airing today on 9/11. So, again, thank you, Greg. Godspeed.
Thank you, Chuck.